This is Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance in Sacramento today, joined by State Senator Josh Newman. And not bad, you just joined the body and you are now Chair of Veterans Affairs. As a veteran yourself, talk to me about that honor and what you plan to do with this committee.
So it's good to be here, Brad.
Thank you, sir.
I'm very gratified as the incoming chair of Veterans Affairs. So as you know, I'm a veteran.
Right.
I served for 4 years, got out. I was an Army officer, artillery officer, got out right before the first Gulf War. But what's probably most relevant is for the last 5 years prior to running, I'd been involved fairly deeply with the Southern California, Greater LA veterans community, working most specifically on veterans employment, on the question as to why young vets coming home, typically from places far away, were having challenges finding good career-oriented employment. And then there's a host of other issues that kind of contribute to their transition and to some of the challenges. And so as the incoming chair, my goal is to close that gap between the rhetoric around vets. I mean, there's a lot of goodwill and there's positive sentiment. But there are gaps in programs, and so that's one of my goals as the chair is to try and close that gap.
I wonder, and I was speaking with a military officer, Yancey Lindsay from San Diego. He's the mayor of the Navy in San Diego. And we were talking about how, it's possible that, you hear one story about a vet with PTSD, and all of a sudden all vets have PTSD. And while PTSD is something serious, someone who has PTSD, can work, but also that doesn't mean all vets are wounded or injured. I mean, to me, vets would be great hires. They're organized, they're disciplined, but yet there's a disconnect at a certain level. And so what can you do, or what you hope to do, to close that disconnect on those questions?
Well, to your point, I mean, so, there are vets who do suffer from service-related issues that serve as barriers not just to employment, but to, sort of a smooth transition to the next phase in their lives. But that's a minority, right? So most studies find that give or take 72% of vets do not suffer from similar issues.
Right.
And so that stereotype of the damaged vet, of the vet with either traumatic brain injury or and symptoms, or PTSD, which I think people find most alarming, largely because of media portrayals, is a minority. And even those vets who do have PTS in some form, most could work, right? And employment is probably the best sort of remedy, medicine for making your way on the next phase. So we can do a lot more. I mean, we need at a minimum to make a better transition possible, which is to say when vets leave the military, any of the four branches, there's not a very good handoff between the Department of Defense and the transition services or programs they get. And then coming home, we don't have a lot of military bases in California, except large San Diego, a couple others. And so, but we do send the most young men and women into the military, and as a result, if they get out fairly early, we get the most back. But if they're not integrated or welcomed smartly when they come home, this is a high cost of living state. This is a very different economic landscape than I think, and military skills would necessarily lend themselves to. So we need to do a better job there in finding those vets early, engaging them smartly, and then harnessing the talent that you pointed to. And connecting them to employers for whom those talents would be, I think, hugely productive.
I want to shift gears a bit and speak about transportation. We're shifting gears and talking about transportation. Who would have thunk it?
Right.
Anyway, what we know about the transportation system in the state of California is we have huge needs. We know that our state roads, $59 billion worth of repairs, local roads, $78 billion worth of repairs. I mean, you look at some of these studies that come out, what is it, like 65%, 68% of our roads are okay or poor. And so there's been moves before you came to the legislature to improve transportation funding. They haven't happened. We're in special session. They haven't happened. But now it looks like there may be some movement because maybe Democrats have 2/3 or who knows. But talk to us about the transportation funding question before we talk about SCA 2.
So I don't know that the current move toward addressing the need, it doesn't have, it's not solely attributable to Democrats having a supermajority. I think there's a true consensus, both rural, suburban, urban, that our transportation needs have not been met for a long time, and so that has come to the fore.
But part of the challenge, though, is that where do we get funding for it?
Yes.
And there are many Democrats who say, look, we haven't seen the gas tax increase since 1994. When you consider inflation, when you consider vehicles that are more fuel efficient, that don't even use fuel, maybe we should look toward increasing the gas tax. Our friends, your friends on the Republican side, are not interested in that strategy. But we're looking at vehicles miles traveled or toll roads, HOV lanes. There are a lot of possibilities. So where do you see that mix coming down?
So, I mean, it will necessarily have to be a mix.
Right.
I think you have to start from the baseline, the fundamental observation that we don't, within our current fiscal resources, have the capacity to do things that are necessary to improve our transportation infrastructure. So, you're going to have to increase revenues in some way. So I'm not directly involved in that. So Senator Bell on my side, on the Senate side, Assemblyman Frazier on the other side, both have different versions of legislation that would introduce a range of elements that would raise either fees or taxes, depending on how you look at it, to create the funds necessary to do the work.
But you are looking at this question in a very direct but slightly different way, through a different lens. What we do know is there's been a lot of frustration because there are funds that are dedicated to transportation spending, but somehow they get diverted.
Right.
They get diverted because we're in a tough budget cycle, and I know that I think it's trucking fees, there's a diversion.
Truck
weight fees, there was a diversion.
Right.
And so you are looking at an actual constitutional amendment to prevent those types of diversions. Be specific, Senator. What do you hope to do?
So specifically, and so, pursuant to whatever the eventual bill that gets passed, if something is passed, the intent of my SCA 2 constitutional amendment would be to put to the voters in 2018 a proposition that would mandate that any new funds or revenues that are generated for transportation would be allocated and exclusively spent on transportation only.
It's that simple.
It is that simple.
Right.
Yeah.
The question becomes, while intuitively this feels like it's the right move, just to play the other side, if we should hit the skids, another terrible metaphor, but if we should hit the skids, sometimes we may need to tap into other funds. I mean, we've done that on the education front, for example, borrowing against Prop 98. We're paying that back now, but be that as it may, do we want to hamstring future legislatures if there is an economic downturn? Because that's what this would do.
Well, there's a difference, Brad, between a downturn and a crisis.
Right.
And so downturns are inevitable.
Right.
And we need to, so I think the voters do want the assurance that even in a mild downturn, that we're not making political decisions that run counter to the intent of the original legislation. In a crisis, I think it's reasonable to consider.
And does this allow for crisis action?
We're open to it.
I understand. You haven't even finished drafting.
That's correct.
The legislation.
Yeah.
So what do your friends in the legislature think? Because, look, again, intuitively, it feels good, but you never know. I mean, there are concerns about tying up future legislatures. What are your Dems, Reaps, what are they saying?
So, I mean, just to use one data point, so my SCA went through the Transportation Committee on the Senate side yesterday. It was a 9-0 vote, 9 out of 11.
Reaps said yes.
No Reaps said no, I will say that. So,
okay, well stated,
No Republicans said no.
And no Dem said no, obviously.
No Dem said no. And so I do think if you look at some recent local initiatives, right, so Prop M in Los Angeles, one of the things that made Prop M successful, which is to say attractive to the voters, palatable to the voters, was there was a very explicit work list of projects and an assurance that any monies raised by Prop M would be used for that dedicated purpose. So we're just extending that principle at the
We'll
state
have you
level.
back.
Looking forward to it.
He is State Senator Josh Newman. My name is Brad Pomerance. You're coming to us from Sacramento on Local Edition.